Welcome to NeuroEmergent, where we explore the emerging science and culture of neurodiversity. I'm your host, Carrie Stewart Lingle, and I am actually autistic.
Finally, our Autism Walk t-shirt, the amazing t-shirt that you're wearing with the fantastic design on it, is by Tess Hudson of the Connection Club. We're going to get ready for the walk in just 1 minute over by the cement truck.
That was Toby Rates, Executive Director of the Autism Society of Oregon, kicking off the 4th annual Autism Walk in Salem on Saturday, May 23rd. I've interviewed Toby twice before on the show, and both times she said this.
Everything in autism is controversial.
And she is so right. Not that you'd know it if you stumbled onto the Autism Walk at Salem's Riverfront Park on Saturday. There was face painting for the kids, and it wouldn't be a neurodivergent event without some Star Wars cosplayers posing for pics. But if you knew what to look for, the controversy was there, just below the surface. The Autism Society's mission is to connect autistic people, both children and adults, with the supports they need. And at the Autism Walk, there were info booths for various public services and nonprofit community organizations like Creating Opportunities, the ARC Oregon, and the Connection Club. There were also a lot of for-profit companies promoting applied behavioral analysis therapy. Some neurodiversity activists, most notably the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, oppose ABA therapy because they believe it focuses on compliance at the expense of children's psychological safety, well-being, and autonomy. And this controversy is just one issue in a wider debate in the autism community over who gets to speak for who, and also how. My guest today is a part of that wider debate. Dr. Vaish Sarathy is a Portland-based learning consultant and host of the podcast Nonlinear Learning, which offers strategies for teaching neurodivergent children with a wide range of intellectual and/or motor impairments. For some of her clients and for her own son, Sarathy uses facilitated communication techniques that are, well, controversial. She is part of a community known as Spellers, who use various systems such as spelling to communicate and the Spellers method. These techniques are not supported by the scientific research establishment, but they are supported by the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. Sarathy, who has a PhD in chemistry, is featured in a recent advocacy documentary titled Spellers, and she also shared her story in a 2019 TEDx talk titled Who Decides How Smart You Are? Welcome to NeuroEmergent, Dr. Sarathy.
Thank you so much, Carrie.
Let's just start with nonlinear learning. What is nonlinear learning? And tell me about your practice, theory, and educational business, I guess.
It's many things. It's a whole philosophy that learning and education don't progress in a straight line. Whether neurotypical people learn linearly or not is up for grabs. Perhaps most people don't. But the way that school systems are structured is in a very linear fashion. Is like you learn addition, and then you learn subtraction, and then you learn multiplication, and then division, and then you learn higher math. Math is very linearly taught, so it's a great example to give. But when a child or a student is taught certain skills, they wait for mastery of earlier skills before they're taught other skills. I mean, you have to prove that you understood everything until then, and then you get to be taught the other skills. This doesn't, in my experience, and a lot of nonlinear education is shaped by my work with my son, homeschooling him, and he's 18 now. He has Down syndrome. He's autistic and non-speaking. But also, I work with many other non-speaking autistic students who are also learning math and science from me. And I've learned that this idea of waiting until mastery of a topic and then teaching the other topic has never worked well. And I often share an example where when my son was younger and I was teaching him multiplication, and it wasn't like he was answering any questions. He was just looking at me. He was just starting to make some choices at the time and just point at the right answer. When I taught him division, it was a clear kind of a catastrophe. Like he just didn't get it. He wasn't interested. And the general model right now is that if that happens, what you do is you back up. You're like, okay, he's not ready for division. We need to back up. We need to get like solid on the math foundations. And At the time, I didn't want to back up because I'd already spent a lot of time teaching the earlier concepts. I was like, what if we just skip division and move on? And we did. We just like for years, we didn't do division. We moved on to exponents, we moved on to geometry. And if there was any division, I would just do it. And eventually he figured out division, but we skipped many steps in at the beginning. So, and that's what nonlinear means is that people don't learn in straight lines. And if we keep gatekeeping our children's education, thinking that, oh, they haven't learned this, so we can't teach them this, then we're always going to be either playing catch up or what is probably much worse is that significantly demotivating our kids.
So let me back up just a little bit and ask more about your background. Now, you've been living in Portland for more than 20 years, and your background is in chemistry and math. Can you just give me a little bit more? Who are you? Where are you from? What was your original career path before it found a new path?
I think my journey has also been very nonlinear. I did my master's in chemistry in India, and I came here. I did a master's in environmental science and engineering. My PhD was in environmental chemistry, so I was actually studying treatment of contaminated groundwater. And after my PhD, I joined Intel as an environmental engineer. I was not in the education space at all, but basically I left Intel when my son was 3, and then I was trying to figure out what to do, and I thought I really enjoyed teaching. So I started teaching just regular like AP math and AP chemistry because A, I'd studied chemistry, B, I was good at math. I'd learned math for many years, even though my degrees are not in math. So as I was teaching and I was starting to apply some of the teaching to my son, a lot of what I do as nonlinear teaching is learned on the job. Is like, okay, if I teach this, my student learns. If I do this, then they don't learn. So it's like, it's just a calibration and an iteration back and forth. But I've been teaching both neurotypical and neurodivergent students for maybe 16, 17 years now.
To what extent does your belief or interest in the nonlinear approach go beyond the neurodivergent students to the neurotypical students? Do you think that there's something even broader about it, or is this really about what many people would call special education?
No, there's definitely a lot broader, but there's not much you can do when because a student who's neurotypical is coming to me with certain deadlines. Let's say they have an AP text next week, next month, next quarter, so they're doing a certain exam. So when you have set a student in an educational system within a framework of examinations, you've already set a very linear framework. So I can try, but it depends on how much time they have and how much willingness they have to learn outside the scope of studying for an examination. But yes, even for neurotypical kids, a nonlinear approach works best. But because they are firmly entangled in the examination framework, it's not always feasible for me to do anything nonlinear. I mean, you have to study for the next test. What can you do?
This began with you and your relationship with your son. Can you tell me the story of how that personal relationship developed into something that you are bringing to the wider world?
My son Sid has Down syndrome and autism. Um, I think what's unique is that we didn't know he was autistic until he was 4, but he was non-speaking. And it was until I saw another girl with Down syndrome who had come to our place. And I was kind of isolated from the community in his early years, just like I just didn't make an effort. And when he was 4 and I saw this other girl and who was speaking some words and pointing to things and interacting with her environment, I was shocked. I was like, oh, I thought this was Down syndrome, but this seems to be more. And then we got a diagnosis of autism. And since I have actually met kids who have Down syndrome and who are autistic, and Sid still doesn't fit many of those boxes because he has motor impairment, like his fine motor skills and gross motor skills are significantly low, even when compared to other kids who have Down syndrome or who are autistic. So he's been described as a box in a box in a box, like as a very unique, like you just don't have any frame of reference. Like in general, I've never met a teacher who's worked with Sid who has had any frame of reference on how do I work with this kid. So obviously, like he was severely underestimated, and he was like he had some sort of a diagnostic test when he was 3 by I think it was early intervention, but who said that he was in the 0.1 percentile of his peers intellectually. So the thing is that I think I'm also a very competitive and ambitious person. Maybe not competitive, but I'm ambitious. And at the time, I had started hearing about this lady called Soma Mukhopadhyay, who was developing spelled communication, who had developed spelled communication in Austin. Her method is called Rapid Prompting Method, or RPM. And just by looking at the work of a few other people who had experimented with education before me, I was able to see that Sid had really, it seemed to be no means of communication, but he seemed to be looking at me when I was teaching, let's say, addition or multiplication. He seemed to be somewhat interested. So there's one primary thing is that I think it was six, there was an incident that happened and I just decided to assume intelligence. And in my TEDx talk, I say this one phrase, and I say, assuming intelligence reveals intelligence. Because when you assume intelligence, it is a mindset shift. It starts with a mindset shift, because a lot of times the kids that you're working with do not have the motor skills to prove their intelligence to you. So if you're waiting for proof, you're going to be waiting a very long time and doing nothing. But if you just decide, if the educator decides on their end that, okay, right now I'm going to assume you intelligence and I'm going to figure out a way to reach you. So it's my job to figure out a path to reach you. That was the trial and error. So I teach this. It doesn't seem like he's interested, but I try it this way and then he works, and back and forth. And of course, it was not all my work. Then I looked at what Soma was doing with RPM. And there was this man called Glenn Doman who had something called the Doman method that I used in Sid's early years for a year or two. And I tried some principles by this movement therapist called Anat Baniel, who does something called neuromovement. So I was integrating different things, but I just made it a rule to only listen to people who were presuming competence. At the minute somebody said, use the word cognitive delay, people used to use harsher words in even 15 years ago, and the R word and so on. I won't even say them, but when people used to say, oh, significant delay, this, that, I would just like tune out and not listen. So I was very selective in what input would come into me.
Did you do anything with public schools with him at all? Or did you decide immediately to do some homeschooling? Or tell me a little bit about that.
He did go to public school. He went to Montessori for the first 3 years, like age 3, 4, and 5. And it was a very inclusive, early Montessori is very hands-on and very inclusive. We had a great teacher and a great environment. Because Sid's motor skills were not that great, I don't know if he actually internalized all the benefits of a Montessori education, but it was a very compassionate and very nice atmosphere. Then first grade, maybe around 6, he went to public school for 1 year, which was really not a very good fit at all, because they really didn't know how to work with him. And grade 2 onwards, he was homeschooled for a couple of years. Then he went back to public school for another couple of years, and then he was homeschooled. So we'd gone back and forth, but overall, I think eventually I came to this point where I wasn't expecting an education from public school, because I don't think the system had the tools to know what to work with him or how to work with him. Acceptance, inclusion, just an environment of peers, that was something that I could expect. But I think after 6th grade, middle school, even that was harder. So I remember by the time Sid was spelling, so when he came back, he said, I beg you to homeschool me. I think this was 1 month after 6th grade. And so we then homeschooled.
Your son is a very unique box, you mentioned. And that means you're probably working with a lot of students who are also their own set of unique boxes. So I'm wondering about how your system and the things that you teach and put on your podcast has evolved as you've worked with more and more students. I'd really like to hear more about the development of your ideas.
So I built 10 principles of nonlinear education, and I think I would say every one of my students, kind of helped me develop one of those principles. For example, that one of my principles is that let there be gaps. So I have this student who's 7-year-old. Yeah, well, he's 8 now, and he came to me as a 6-year-old. And over time, his communication has improved. Now he's open with his letter board, which is just an A through Z board. It's just a low-tech board. And I was really trying to really develop this child's educational input in many ways. So I tried to move laterally. I tried to give some history, some math, some science. And I would notice that I would see a lot of behaviors when we're doing science. But when I'm doing math, I would notice that, okay, he's actually a little bit calm. And eventually he was able to spell and tell me that stop boring me with science and art. I just want to do math. So, and I actually don't like doing that because I want him to develop a little bit of an all-rounded knowledge on everything, but it doesn't work. So I've just had to really internalize my idea of let there be gaps. Okay, there's going to be gaps. Maybe later when he's 12 or 13, he'll be open to learning something else. And I try to sneak in some science here and there, but he won't have it. He is so good at making connections and drawing patterns in math that even in math, like for example, he's 8 and I'm teaching him exponents right now. But there's some areas in geometry that he doesn't know. And but he's just so excited about exponents. And then I kind of have to like say, like, listen, if you really want to go ahead in math, we're going to have to learn some of the other skills. You're going to have to learn a little bit of geometry, a little bit of what the area and the circumference are. Otherwise, you'll notice yourself stuck in a certain way. Sometimes I'll sneak in a lesson, but that's one of my principles. Let there be gaps.
So on New Year's Day of this year, you released your 200th episode of the Nonlinear Learning podcast. You talk about 5 tips that parents of autistic children or children with educational needs often get that you don't agree with. The first one is stick to strict routines and structure. And you said, well, maybe not.
I think strict routines can help some people, but I think strict routines can limit learning. The process of learning is the process of change in your brain, right? The process of making new networks and expanding. Because autism is very strongly correlated with pattern formation. And generally, most motor-based disabilities are. So anytime there's a fine motor or gross motor delay associated with a developmental disability, often you'll find pattern formation being a very strong correlation. And I think perhaps it's because movement is so hard that sticking to known patterns is easier. So, and the more you reinforce that pattern, the harder it is to break out of that pattern. And that's really all there is to it. And then regardless of where you're forming the pattern, in order to teach something new, you have to have a new experience. And if you don't allow for freedom to form new experiences. And I'm not talking about utter chaos. I'm not saying do one thing today and just like throw everything out of the box tomorrow, because that's a recipe for dysregulation. Safety needs repetition and pattern to like internal feelings of safety need repetitions and pattern. Just see if you can help your child experience something outside the routine on a regular basis, things that change. We often do routines because it's easier for parents and our schedules, because if we have a routine, then we know when we're working. But it is very hard to be fluid in routines with our kids, because it means being fluid in routines with ourselves. And I'm saying that because also like my whole day is extremely scattered. I don't have, it's hard for me to like put everything in a very strong routine, because somewhere something falls apart. And I think most parents of a kid with disability will find that that is the case for them. So yes, you need routines, but you need fluidity in routines in order to learn.
So your number 3 item on the list of helpful parenting tips that can limit autistic learning was join support groups and build a support network. Maybe this was one of your controversial points.
Yeah, that was
but
the one.
you questioned the helpfulness of support groups. What are your mixed feelings or experiences with support groups?
I think in children with, I don't think we've agreed on a singular word to use when a child is experiencing significant dysregulation. Like some people will say profound autism, some people will say severe disabilities, or when you're parenting a child with very high support needs. We have not learned to separate grief from support. So a lot of times, like you're going into places that are actually grief support networks, and there has to be an expiry date for grief. There's nothing wrong with experiencing whatever you're experiencing. But a lot of times I find that people are in support networks for a very long time, and which are just grief and groups masquerading as support groups. Because you're really only a support group if you're supporting progress, in my opinion, which is different from a community. So there are communities that are like, let's try this, that are growth oriented. And those are the words. When I use the word community, I think about like-minded people moving towards a purpose. And in the autism space, in the Down syndrome space, I have really not seen support groups do that. I hope that the future will be different. I think that it's already being different. I think people are already starting to wake up. But it's the vibe that I got when I was young was that my life is so hard, your life is so hard. Let's kind of be sad together, which is, I'm trivializing it a lot. There is a space for that if you're going through a lot of grief, but that space cannot be for the entire lifetime of your child, because then when are you going to, like, how is it going to help you? When I started teaching, I was very much on the fringe of what was being done with education. I perhaps still am, but there are a lot more people doing it. I was very much on the fringe of even assuming intelligence, because Down syndrome was and it continues to be considered an intellectual delay. In order to think differently, you had to kind of step out of support groups. You had to step out of most groups where the minute I discussed it, these ideas would immediately be trampled upon. It's like, of course, this is not possible. So that is the other thing. If you're trying to do something different with your child, you may want to see if the community around you is going to like pull you up or bring you down. I think it depends on, it could go either way. So you just want to like analyze, check in.
I'm not a parent of any kind of child, just for fur babies. So I cannot really imagine the difficulty of the challenge of taking charge of a child's education when the education system is not equipped to really do it. I spent my journalism career in Arizona, and one of my colleagues down there, Amy Silverman, has written books. She has a daughter with Down syndrome who just this year, I believe, was admitted to college. Now, this is a great feel-good story in a lot of ways, but I am in such awe of Amy because she is not only able to do everything she's done for her daughter and write a book about it and write a blog about it, all of that while also doing her actual journalism career for the paper she worked at. What my heart always goes to is how many children are lucky enough to have that mom, and how many moms just don't have that capacity, or dads or uncles or whatever in a child's caregiving community, because what it took to get a girl with Down syndrome educated to the point that she was accepted to college was a lifelong extra full-time job on that person's part.
Absolutely.
And I guess I've gotten lost in the emotions of that, but I'm wondering if you can look into the future of, are there lessons that you and your community are working on that can eventually filter into public education, might be able to ease the burden on parents, or is this really about having to leverage, serious time and effort in order to see the benefits that you write about and talk about?
Right now it is. Right now it absolutely is what you said, is that having to not just time, effort, but also like breaking away from anything that like just like creating your own idea of what education is, like basically building everything from scratch, like bringing like time and effort are okay, but then you're also building ideas from scratch. So, but the speller community is evolving and is a few thousand people strong now, and they're doing a lot of advocacy. There's pushback against these forms of communication. There's people that, both in the political space and in the speech speech organizations space, that don't want spelled communication, or don't believe in it, or are threatened by it, or whatever. And however, spellers are now, many are going to college, many have graduated from college, many have are earning, and there are many things like that are happening. And this community, I think they're doing so much fabulous advocacy to what happens when you presume competence in a child. What happens when you don't presume, when you don't start with the assumption of intellectual disability, what we call the least dangerous assumption. And what happens when you give communication access that works for everybody. I want to bet that I think it might be 10 or 15 years, but I think that this will percolate into the educational system. So, it won't have to be that a single parent doing all the hard work.
I was wondering if you can do an introduction for our listeners. What are spellers? What is the speller community? Can you give some explanation?
So spelled communication. So spellers actually can stand for two things. For just people who use a letterboard and a very simple pointing to letter by letter to form sentences, poetry, books. And these people are just broadly called spellers by some. They might be called letterboarders. You might hear different terms, but nowadays most people are saying spellers. So this was started by this woman called Soma Mukhopadhyay, who came to the US from India and settled in Austin and started teaching RPM, or rapid prompting method. These were the original spellers. RPM is still quite popular. So after RPM, we had two other methods that came up that were kind of derivatives of RPM. One was called S2C, which is spelling to communicate, and one was called the speller's method. So I just want to differentiate that sometimes we use the word spellers broadly, which I'm doing, but sometimes the speller's method is a specific spelled communication method. The movie spellers.com or spellersthemovie.com profiles 8 individuals who used spelling as a means of communication. One of them is Sid. But yeah, there are just 8 different stories to be observed. And it's, I think, really good to watch, to see how people from different spaces, many of them, I think other than Sid, all of them were adults in the movie. So these people had not received an education of any sort for most of their lives, or they'd just been taught the alphabet. And yeah, so that's what the spellers are. They're people who use alternative means to communicate, usually very low tech means, to produce very high tech language.
And I'm going to ask you if you can explain a little bit about why this is controversial and why there's some pushback about it.
Yeah, I think the main thing is because this requires, in the beginning, it requires a communication partner, which means it requires somebody to hold the letterboard. It's part of the scaffolding. Most people in the end, like you'll see a lot of spellers who are now, even people in the movie, they're spelling without a communication partner. They're completely independent. It leads to independence, but it starts with some sort of scaffolding, which is just somebody holding a letterboard and then this person communicating. And sometimes people need that communication partner. We call them a communication regulation partner, because regulation is a big thing when you're talking about non-speakers. It is just like this huge thing. So somebody holding the letterboard seems to make a lot of difference. And I think the reason that it's controversial is people don't understand. People expect communication to always be a solo activity, when it's actually in reality never a solo activity. Like how I respond to you often, almost always depends on how I see you responding to me. So, and if I took you away and put another person in your place, I'd probably be talking to them differently. There's a lot more emerging research on this, but I think it's primarily that people don't know what to do with the idea of a communication partner.
Okay. Well, I'm going to let you go. Thank you so much for your time. Dr. Vaish Sarathy is the host of the Nonlinear Learning Podcast and is based in Portland, Oregon. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you for having me, Kerry. Yeah, it was great talking to you. Thank you.
You have been listening to Neuroemergent. This podcast is presented by Lonesome George Productions. Our theme music was composed by Doug Lingle, and our production assistant is P.F. Lingle. I'm your host, Kerry Stewart Lingle, and actually, this is the final episode of Neuroemergent. I launched the show last June, and I am so grateful for all the connections that I've made and everything that I have learned. Although I will no longer be hosting a monthly show, I plan to continue as a volunteer with my producing partners, KBOO Community Radio in Portland and KMUZ Community Radio in Salem. So hopefully you'll be hearing my voice again sometime soon.